The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
A supreme week in America as the highest court in the land lays down the law on 3 explosive issues and then prepares for a new justice. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com. The nation's highest court weighs in on a trio of explosive issues: the travel ban, compelled membership in public unions, and pro-life clinics forced to inform women about abortions. And then drops the biggest bombshell of all, the retirement of the man holding the swing vote on the court. We'll break down an historic week for the Supreme Court with LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza in just a moment. Plus, the left, the media, and never-Trump Republicans descend deeper into their bottomless cauldron of seething hatred for Donald Trump. We'll play you the latest examples. And on a more uplifting note, as we approach July 4th, we consider the question, is the spirit of independence still alive in America? So, 3 big cases settled by the Supremes this week. That would have been more than enough for the court watchers and average citizens to chew on for a good long time. But then, even that explosive trio of decisions was overshadowed by the announcement that Justice Anthony Kennedy is stepping down, clearing the way for President Trump to nominate a Neil Gorsuch-type replacement who will undoubtedly swing the court further in the constitutional direction. So let's start there as we welcome in LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza. And Scott, the left is all hysterical about the Kennedy retirement. We're going to play some of the hysterical reaction later in the show about overturning Roe versus Wade and the like. But just to provide an accurate picture of the key role Anthony Kennedy has played on this court for the longest time, we've essentially had 4 leftist justices, 4 constitutionalist justices, and a swing vote. First Sandra Day O'Connor, and then Anthony Kennedy, both right of center, but hardly like Scalia or Thomas. Now, I've heard more than one lawyer say that most of these landmark cases on hot-button issues, in most of these cases, a lower court ultimately says, let's send it up to D.C. to see what Anthony Kennedy thinks. And some have argued that he's been de facto the most powerful man in America. But on the other hand, I still can't help but think this is something of an overreaction, because replacing Kennedy with a Scalia-Gorsuch type justice doesn't really change the fundamental ideological composition of the court the way the retirement of one of the 4 leftist justices would.
I think that's right.
I mean, 6-3 is a lot different than 5-4, and the right, so to speak, or the constitutionalists are getting in the 5-4 decisions. They're getting Justice Kennedy to go along with most of them, but not all of them.
For most. Justice Kennedy has written, I think, all of the major gay rights, homosexual kind of freedom cases that we've had in the past decade. So for that major social value issue, anyway, Kennedy has been not on the right on those cases. He wrote Obergefell, the case declaring that that the Constitution protects gay marriage, and always has, as a matter of fact. That's what that decision says. So it's hardly a conservative decision. So I think that while it may be overblown, certainly some of the hysteria I've seen, some of the reaction I've seen borders on hysteria and is therefore overblown. But he was a swing vote, and he did. He was not a reliable vote for the conservative bloc, and I would say that it's not necessarily a small government bloc. There are small government people on that court, okay, but for instance, Justice Alito is certainly not a small government type.
Yeah.
Justice Roberts voted that the Constitution allows the government to tax people for not buying health insurance, let's recall, and for imposing a scheme to require Americans to buy a low-benefit, high-deductible, high-premium insurance policy. I don't see that as a conservative notion, Tim. How those lines play out is a little more subtle, I think, and I think it will be a big deal if we get a replacement for Justice Kennedy that's like Justice Gorsuch. Whether we do get that or not, and we don't necessarily know. We have a good sense of Justice Gorsuch's jurisprudence because of the experience we have with his basically a year and a half long tenure now on the court. But it takes a few years for us to really, as court watchers, kind of get a sense. To get a real sense of like where the nuance is with their constitutional thinking and where they're going to draw the line for some of these decisions. For the broad strokes, maybe we can point to other opinions that give us a sense. But it takes years of watching their jurisprudence for that to kind of fully come out. So we'll see, Tim, whether or not Justice Gorsuch is, who we think he is today. In other words, is that borne out? And I think he is more of a libertarian-ish type justice than Justice Scalia was. Perhaps Justice Kennedy's replacement will be an improvement. We have the list of justices that Trump released. And
that list is critical because that's the list that produced Gorsuch and a couple of dozen others. And now I presume he's going to go back to that well again.
The Supreme Court is our third branch of government, and in fact, in many ways, it's the most important branch because with the exception of constitutional amendments, there is no appeal from any one of their decisions. So they are, I think was it Justice Kennedy or Powell? Somebody said that the Supreme Court is not the last word because they're infallible. They're infallible because they are the last word.
Right.
So
they speak ex cathedra, as Catholics would say about the Pope. But let's get to the travel ban.
Just let me finish my point there, which was that Donald Trump gave this list prior to the election so that the public could vote. This was an issue in the election, and he said, these are the people who I will consider for the court. So if this is an important question for you ahead of time, not this some black box that other candidates would say, well, we're going to consider all the, sure, of course, you're going to consider all the highly qualified candidates, but we all know that's a bunch of junk. You've got a short list. Who's on your short list? And Trump disclosed it. So whether you like him or not, at least you had the facts before you made the judgment on the election.
And certainly many who voted for Trump voted for him maybe not only because, but certainly primarily because of what he would do with the Supreme Court.
Well, Tim, I think that if you look at Justice Ginsburg's health and age and temperament, you have to think that she would be the number 3 if Hillary were in office. So that would be 3 picks that Hillary would have on the court instead of, at least for so far anyway, Trump having 2.
Well,
it's a remarkable difference we'll see in America in the coming years because of these picks.
Well, right now, it seems that a certainty that none of those leftist justices will leave the court other than in a pine box, and that for 2 more years, 2.5 years of the Trump presidency, they may survive. Hard to see them surviving 6, though.
Well, Ginsburg, I think, is the only person on that court who seems to be so old that she would seem ready to go. Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor, they're not old people.
And Breyer's not too old either.
And let's recall, they're not North Sea oil rig platform workers. It's a pretty cushy office job. So I think it can be handled by somebody who's more senior in years.
Okay, Scott will rejoin us a bit later on to discuss the trio of game-changing decisions by the Supreme Court on the Trump travel ban and compelled behavior, compelled membership in public unions, and compelled speech by pro-life pregnancy centers. Have the facts at your fingertips with the new LibertyNation.com app. Simply download LibertyNation.com from the App Store or Play Store, that would be Apple or Google, and be good to go on the go. Next up, say what? The left, the media, and never Trump Republicans losing their minds over President Trump.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner. This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time. Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
Say What, the portion of Liberty Nation Radio where we roll out some of the most wacky, astonishing, and damnable things uttered by politicians and the chattering class about the events and issues of the day. As this historic week in the Supreme Court unfolded, the left and their handmaidens in the elite media were enveloped by panic. It was bad enough that the court reinstituted the Trump travel ban and weakened the grip of public unions and stopped the forced practice of pro-life clinics informing women about how to get an abortion. But when the swing vote on the court, moderate conservative Anthony Kennedy announced his retirement, sure to be replaced by a constitutionalist like Neil Gorsuch, with Republicans needing just 51 votes to confirm, leftists started melting down, with CNN's legal expert, Jeffrey Toobin, hysterically predicting the imminent reversal of Roe versus Wade.
Let's talk about what America is going to be like that's different. You are going to see 20 states pass laws banning abortion outright, just banning abortion, and because they know that there are now going to be 5 votes on the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade. And abortion will be illegal in a significant part of the United States in 18 months.
But hysteria on the left was hardly limited to the retirement of a Supreme Court justice following 2 recent events when Trump officials were threatened, intimidated, and shouted down and out of restaurants by angry gangs of leftists because of all those reports about people entering the country illegally being separated from their children. Mad Maxine Waters whipped a crowd into a frenzy by instructing them to do more of the same.
If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
Well, that is exactly what the Nazis did to the Jews in Germany. Targeted them, intimidated them, threatened them. And President Trump was more than happy to pour gasoline on the flames by tweeting out for like the 3rd time that Maxine Waters is an extraordinarily low IQ person. It seems clear Trump is trying to bait Mad Max, and she is taking the bait. And now Trump and the GOP will do their best to make this radical leftist woman the face of the Democratic Party as they seek to maintain control of the Senate and House in November's midterm elections. But the left is getting so desperate that over on MSNBC, Donnie Deutsch, who was once a colleague of Trump's, was reduced to not just condemning the president, but calling the people who voted for him the equivalent of Nazi prison guards.
We can no longer say Trump's the bad guy. If you vote for Trump, you're the bad guy. If you vote for Trump, you are ripping children from parents' arms. What the Democrats have to do is make the next election a referendum on not who Trump is, but who you are. If you vote for Trump, then you, the voter, you, not Donald Trump, are standing at the border like Nazis going, you here, you here.
So now not just Trump, but the 62 million people who voted for him have been labeled Nazis as well. That's all the left has got. But not to be outdone, the washed-up, disgraced former CBS News anchor Dan Rather went on the Don Lemon show on CNN, you know, the ultimate in fake news, and said Trump is essentially becoming Stalin.
This is classic authoritarianism, which can very quickly lead to dictatorship or even totalitarianism. The President of the United States is not a descendant of some sun god, and he doesn't serve because he's been given a divine mandate.
Although most on the left did think Barack Obama was given such a divine mandate, but never mind that. Now Trump has ripped apart everything Obama built, and Trump derangement syndrome has spread like a cancer. And folks, it's not limited to Democrats and leftists. Let us not forget and always remember those addled, never-Trump Republicans continuing their own scorched earth rhetoric, like so-called Republican strategist Anna Navarro on Warehouse CNN.
What you see is a guy, an administration that has been revealed through this to be a bunch of folks that are cruel, callous, cynical, lying, incompetent fools.
Right, but other than that, they're probably okay people. But on that same CNN, another of those never-Trump so-called Republicans, washed-up political strategist Steve Schmidt declared Trump's obvious affinity with Adolf Hitler.
In the 240th year of the independence of the United States, in 3 states by 78,000 votes, the American people, by a fluke, elected an imbecilic, former reality TV show host and con man whose only affinity for reading anything were the Adolf Hitler speeches he kept on his nightstand.
Now, folks, let me reiterate, that is Steve Schmidt, Republican, and before him, Anna Navarro, Republican. They're what we call CNN Republicans. But another big event this week was the appearance of FBI Director Christopher Wray and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein in a public hearing before the House Judiciary Committee, and it served mostly as an opportunity for Republicans to harangue that duo, as Trey Gowdy did in specifying the flagrant bias investigator Peter Strzok demonstrated in the Inspector General report.
Peter Strzok, who was picked to objectively, fairly, neutrally look into the Russia investigation, was talking about an insurance policy with Andy McCabe and Lisa Page in the event Donald Trump became the president. All of this was happening at the same time Peter Strzok said he could smell the Trump support in Southern Virginia. All this was at the same time that this FBI agent said a Trump presidency would be effing terrifying, and that it will never happen. No, we'll stop it. He was talking about impeachment within 3 days of special counsel Mueller being appointed. 3 days. That's even quicker than MSNBC and the Democrats.
At that same hearing, Congressman Jim Jordan got into it with Rod Rosenstein about media reports that he tried to intimidate House Republicans.
Mr. Rosenstein, did you threaten staffers on the House Intelligence Committee? Media reports indicate you did.
Media reports are mistaken.
Sometimes. But this is what they said. Having the nation's #1 law enforcement officer threaten to subpoena your calls and emails is downright chilling. Did you threaten to subpoena their calls and emails?
No, sir, and there's no way to subpoena phone calls.
That flippant answer well demonstrated the frustration of the Justice Department as they try and fend off charges of transparent bias running through the bloodstream of both the Clinton email and Trump-Russia investigations. Quick break, and then Scott Cosenza rejoins us to discuss 2 critically important Supreme Court rulings.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The historic week at the Supreme Court featured many highlights, or lowlights if you're a leftist. The court upheld the Trump travel ban and made 2 major decisions on compelled behavior in the form of speech and union membership. And Scott Cosenza, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, is back with us to discuss those two big decisions. So, Scott, let's talk travel ban in terms of what the court ruled and the significant admonishment issued by Justice Thomas against the lower court judges who single-handedly ground the wheels of the Trump administration to a halt for more than a year when it came to immigration and travel arrangements.
Hi, Tim. Yes, that's right. The case is Trump v. Hawaii, and it consolidated some of the lower court cases where in federal district courts in Hawaii, in Maryland, in Washington State, and I think at least one other, judges ruled that the travel restrictions, or what's popularly been called the travel ban, or in the Democrat Party circles and anti-Trump circles, the Muslim ban.
Right.
So this case didn't rule on the legality of the Trump administration's actions itself. What happened was the Trump administration put forth these restrictions, said they were going to enforce them. These people sued to have that behavior stopped with the claim that it was unconstitutional because of an anti-religious bias and anti-Muslim bias, violating basically the Establishment Clause, and enacted an injunction basically that prevented the administration from enforcing the rules. The Trump administration challenged the injunction and said,
"Right,
let the policy be enforced while the case is fought." The district court said no. The people are likely to win their case ultimately, and therefore the injunction is appropriate. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed. Other circuit courts of appeals agreed. And then the Supreme Court says, we'll take a look at this injunction. And they rule this week, Tim, that the injunction was improperly granted, that in this case, I believe it was the Attorney General for the state of Hawaii. It's one of these sort of typical things where this is, a Democrat politician who's looking to make a name for himself, challenges the ban to make a stink against the evil Trump administration, and he's going to be our hero. Well, as it turns out, not the case here. And the Supreme Court has said that the injunction was not properly granted, and in fact, they're likely to lose at trial, that the administration is likely to win, that the restrictions that they have imposed are likely not motivated by impermissible religious bias, and that the controlling the immigration functions of our country is how the Constitution is set up. The executive does control that. So that's what they said. It was a 5-4 decision. All the big decisions this week were 5-4,
right,
and almost all the big decisions this term were 5-4. Justice Thomas, I'm sure you appreciated it, wrote extensively about the lower court in his opinion. I think we've talked about it previously, Tim, about how kind of gobsmacked we are that any federal district court judge now feels comfortable deciding these national policy things. And what Justice Thomas said was it wouldn't even be appropriate for you to grant a injunction for the plaintiffs in this case that you've identified, whether that's citizens of Hawaii, if you're the AG of Hawaii, or if somebody's hired a private attorney. But you as a district judge can't decide for every human being in the world that this is an appropriate injunction to issue. That's far afield from your grant of authority, and so that's what Justice Thomas
took time to point out. Sort of saying, stay in your lane at the district court level. Let's move on to another fairly earth-shaking decision on the issue of compelling individuals to join a public union or to pay fees to a public union in order to get a public sector job, like a teacher or a cop or a trash collector. This overturns a decision 40 years ago by the High Court. How far-reaching is this decision likely to be?
I think it's huge, Tim. I think that 20 years from now, we'll look back on the destruction of public labor unions and the power that they wield, both in policy and in sort of partisan electoral circles. They're very formidable right now. They control the Democrat parties in large cities and in many states. They get a significant source of their power from their ability to dole out these campaign contributions, and also just straight sort of manpower, the votes, and getting out the vote sort of things. These unions are very politically active, and what they do is they use money that they get from people, whether, so just if we can recap. So if you take a job as a cop, as a teacher in many jurisdictions, you have to join the local union. And if you don't join, you get a small refund for the political activities, but you still have to have compelled money taken out of your paycheck. So you get your paycheck and it's whatever amount is gone for the union fee. And if you say, well, they don't speak for me, I don't like them, I don't want to be involved in them, they say, well, that's fine, but tough. The government has decided that that's your bargaining unit person, and if you don't like it, you can either quit or stay or not. That's your choice. And the Supreme Court has said that amounts to compelled speech by requiring these employees to pay for representatives that were assigned to them against their will. That's compelled speech, and it violates the First Amendment. That was the majority's ruling. Now, the minority in this case, Justice Sotomayor had a brief, couple paragraph dissent, but mainly the dissent was Kagan's that everybody had signed on to, including Sotomayor. And Justice Kagan spent her entire dissent concerned with how much of the apple cart this ruling was going to upset. There are many, many state laws, regulatory rules in place, and federal too, that are reliant on the Abood decision is the name of the decision that you were referencing earlier from years ago that established that this kind of taking of people's money against their will was okay. And the majority here said it's not okay. It was a mistake to make that ruling, and we have to overturn it to enforce this man's rights. And the minority claim was basically like, well, it's going to be a real big problem, though. And yeah, it is going to be a big problem, but
deference to the administrative state
over the First Amendment rights. And I think that presents to me, Tim, a very clear delineating line between the type of justice that some people want and other people's want. And I want the kind of justice who says, I understand that this is going to be a difficult problem for a lot of government systems and resources, but this man has a First Amendment right to not have compelled speech, and we have to uphold that, rather than some other people who would say, well, it's going to be a significant cost and burden, and his right to, it's a small imposition on him.
Right.
But we weren't established as a nation, that I recall, our founding fathers' great and beautiful language to your rights are important unless there's an imposition on the administrative state, and then they're not.
I think it's important, too, to distinguish between private and public unions. I think everybody agrees that a private union is between employers and their bosses. But even the legendary head of the AFL-CIO, George Meany, said it's impossible to bargain collectively with the government. And no less progressive a figure than Franklin Delano Roosevelt said a strike by public employees is unthinkable and intolerable. Those are FDR's words, and yet the union movement is treating this like a fundamental right has been eliminated by the court. Let's get to the last of the triumvirate of big decisions by the Supremes relating to what pro-life or crisis pregnancy clinics can be forced to tell women seeking their advice and counsel.
In California, these exist in other places too, but this is a case out of California where they set up these crisis pregnancy centers. It's sort of like an anti-abortion clinic. They're designed to get women who may seek abortion services to not consider abortions and consider alternatives to abortions. The people in California who passed this law didn't like that. They wanted these women to be able to get abortion services without having to go through the encounter of dealing with someone who was trying to get them to not have an abortion. And so they just decided to pass a law to make those people...
You have to tell them about abortions.
Have to tell them about these abortions. So what they did was they required... There were sort of two separate requirements, one for centers that had a medical license and one that didn't. And they included notice requirements that they publish in like a dozen languages, information on how to get an abortion, about... cost subsidy payments that may be available in the state for abortion, and just burdensome requirements both for their sort of print advertising and billboards and also for their actual speech and handouts that they would have to give the people who come into their offices. So the court says, that is a impermissible, again, compelled speech, again, 5-4 ruling, same split. Conservative bloc, Roberts, Alito, Thomas and Gorsuch, Kennedy joining for the majority. In the minority, you've got Kagan, Ginsburg, Breyer, and Ginsburg. So same split, and again, compelled speech. And again, we have the liberal bloc okay with the government imposing words in people's mouths when it suits, it seems like, a larger policy goal of allowing for, frustrating people who want to frustrate those who want an abortion, if you can wrap your head around that. And they lost. So I think that's a good win for liberty, Tim, because think of what you will of the abortion issue. To allow the state to tell one group that they disfavor, that they have to put words in their mouth when they're dealing with someone else, it doesn't seem to me how that can be a permissible infringement upon their free speech rights.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thanks for your outstanding coverage of a very busy week at the Supreme Court. I don't imagine that you've gotten a whole lot of sleep this week.
I haven't.
All right. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
Have the facts at your fingertips with the new LibertyNation.com app. Simply download LibertyNation.com from the Apple App Store or Google Play Store and be good to go on the go. Coming up, we'll close things out by asking the question in this run-up to July 4th, is the spirit of independence still alive in America?
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, another Independence Day beckons in this upcoming week, and unlike so many other holidays, we seem to take seriously what July 4th represents. Christmas is no longer about Christ, neither is Easter. Memorial Day and Labor Day are just 3-day weekends. But the 4th of July, well, that's when people really do tend to stop and consider the blessings of liberty and the sacrifices made by the extraordinary group of individuals who comprised what we call the Founding Fathers, like George Washington, the sword, Thomas Jefferson, the pen, Patrick Henry, the voice, and all the others, all of them working together, all of them necessary for an impossible revolt against the world's dominant empire to succeed. What they built was a nation of ordered liberty, an experiment in self-government, and lest we forget, that was a truly radical concept in the late 18th century. But most Americans don't even realize that the founders did not have an unwavering belief in the longevity of this constitutional republic. Thomas Jefferson, for one, was not confident that it would last more than one generation. When asked by a citizen after the signing of the Constitution what form of government the founders had instituted, Ben Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Why did these great men see our constitutional republic as so fragile? Well, it was in part because it had never been tried before, but they also understood all too well that self-government based on liberty will disintegrate and ultimately turn to tyranny when liberty turns to license. When a society decides that freedom means nothing more than the right to do or demand anything we want at any time. When freedom is based strictly on an ever-expanding body of rights, untethered from responsibility. When people vote into office those who will make everyone pay for an ever-expanding universe of entitlements. This creates exactly the type of large, powerful, distant, and unaccountable government against which we fought a revolution. There's also a common misperception among the American people, especially as they've been subjected to the steady and relentless deconstruction of American history by the iron triangle of government, academia, and the media, and it has to do with the American Revolution itself. It's remarkable how many Americans believe or just assume that a vast majority of those late 18th century colonists favored rebellion, that the revolution was therefore inevitable, unavoidable even. That's not true. Loyalists to the crown abounded. Families were bitterly divided. Consensus seemed impossible. But the energy, the passion, the commitment, that was all in the camp of the patriots. The loyalists simply wanted to sustain the system, however deep its flaws. But it was the strength, determination, and unwavering commitment of the patriots that won the day. The ensuing process of launching and winning a revolution was an act of audacity unparalleled in human history. A bunch of ragtaggers with little more than a small jingle in their pockets and the clothes on their backs, farmers and laborers and ordinary people, impassioned for rebellion, rallied to a cause by the strength and leadership of rabble-rousing leaders like Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams, speaking truth to power, and molded into a force that achieved the impossible. A pitchfork revolution indeed. Is this starting to sound familiar? The colonists cared far less whether those who would become their leaders in the event of success were untested or even deeply flawed than they did about the willingness of those leaders to cast aside their comfort and wealth accumulated under British rule and put it all on the line for the sake of what came to be America. Still sounding familiar? Well, when the colonists revolted, they knew not what would happen in the aftermath. But they damn sure knew what they needed to do: organize, revolt, tear down the system, and consider the consequences later. Again, familiar? When the institutions that form the foundation of a colony or a nation collapse and lose the trust of their subjects, all it takes is a match to light the growing tinderbox and set the people to revolt. Ask the people of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, or the voters behind the blue wall in the nation's heartland. Now look, not all revolutions are just, and not all revolutions succeed, for so much of humanity is ultimately unwilling to embrace or even accept hard truths and genuine change. And understandably so, because real change is at once so alive with possibility and yet so daunting. Americans faced with the choice of being loyalists to the global and domestic order of the last several decades or patriots seeking a new spark of independence decided to launch a second American Revolution in 2016. The question now is whether that spirit can remain alive in a country so bitterly balkanized that even conversation has become impossible between the forces of independence and the forces seeking to mind meld the American people into a continued embrace of the new world order, which is no longer so new. To the matter of whether the nation can survive the inevitable challenge of this constitutional republic, Ben Franklin is reported to have said, "When the people find they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the republic." John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people." What he meant was, absent a sense of individual responsibility, the foundation of freedom and ordered liberty crumbles. The resistance is a symbol of the growing number of Americans who believe they are entitled to everything from a job to a generous wage to guaranteed and expansive health care, and the ultimate entitlement, getting other people to pay for all of it. We can see right now in Europe the results of the ever-expanding welfare state, economies tumbling like dominoes amid half-hearted attempts to reduce government control that have largely been rejected and led to revolts in Britain and elsewhere on the European continent as the spirit of independence and national sovereignty start to sweep Europe. Will America ultimately choose liberty or return to simply voting themselves money? The answer to this question will determine if we will be a free or dependent people in the years ahead. And on that note, we wish you all the blessings of liberty during this July 4th week. We'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. And don't forget, this program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, are available to you on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. This is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.